The year was 1971, and in the wealthy, manicured town of Westfield, New Jersey, appearances were everything. It was a place where lawns were kept with military precision, where neighbors nodded politely from driveways, and where secrets were buried deep behind heavy velvet drapes. But no house held more secrets or more darkness than the looming 19-room Victorian mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue. They called it Breeze Knoll. It sat on a rise, looking down on the street like a judging king, its stained glass windows dark and unblinking. To the outside world, the man who lived there, John Emil List, was a pillar of the community, a devout Sunday school teacher, a successful accountant, a man who wore thick-rimmed glasses and conservative suits, who walked with a stiff, rigid posture that suggested a man in total control of his life. But inside the cold, echoing halls of Breeze Knoll, the air was thick with a suffocating tension, a rot that was spreading unseen, eating away at the foundation of the family he claimed to love so dearly. It was November, and the autumn chill had already settled into the bones of the old house. The wind would whistle through the cracks, sounding almost like a warning whisper, but John List was the only one who could truly hear it. You see, the perfect life he projected was a lie. A meticulously constructed house of cards that was trembling in the breeze. He had lost his job as a bank vice president weeks ago, but he couldn't bear the shame of admitting it. The humiliation was a specter he could not face. So, every morning, with the regularity of a clock, he would dress in his suit and tie, eat his breakfast in silence, and leave the house. But he didn't go to an office. He went to the train station, where he would sit on a bench for hours, reading newspapers, staring blankly at the tracks, watching the trains come and go, carrying men with real jobs to real destinations while he sat in a purgatory of his own making. He would eat a cheap lunch, count the minutes, and then return home, playing the role of the provider, the patriarch, the man of God. But the money was gone. The bank accounts were bleeding dry. He had been stealing from his own elderly mother, Alma, who lived in the third-floor apartment of the mansion, siphoning her life savings just to keep the lights on and the facade intact. He watched his wife, Helen, drifting further into her own demons, her health failing, a glass often in her hand, her eyes carrying a sorrow he felt he could no longer fix. He watched his children, 16-year-old Patricia, 15-year-old John Jr., and 13-year-old Frederick. They were good children, bright and full of life, but in John's twisting, darkening mind, he saw them standing on the precipice of a great abyss. In his strict, rigid theology, poverty wasn't just a misfortune, it was a moral failing. It was a sin. To be poor was to be without God's favor. He looked at the peeling paint of the mansion, the unpaid bills he hid in his desk, and he felt the walls closing in. He believed the world was wicked, that the 1970s were ushering in a tide of immorality that would swallow his children whole if he couldn't provide the shelter and status they needed. The pressure in his head was building, not like a sudden explosion, but like the slow, crushing weight of deep water. He began to see his family not as people to be cherished, but as souls in desperate need of salvation. But how do you save a soul when the ship is sinking? In the silence of his study, surrounded by religious texts and ledgers of debt, a monstrous idea began to take root. It started as a whisper, a dark intruder in his prayers. If they lost the house, they would lose their standing. If they lost their standing, they would lose their faith. If they lost their faith, they would lose heaven. The logic was cold, metallic, and terrifyingly absolute. He convinced himself that he wasn't planning a tragedy. He was planning a rescue mission. He looked at the calendar on the wall, the days of November ticking by, and he knew he was running out of time. The mortgage was due. The lies were fraying. The masquerade was over. The accountant had crunched the numbers of his life, and the only solution he could see, the only way to balance the ledger of their eternal souls, was to subtract them from this world entirely. The decision settled over him like a heavy woolen blanket, suffocating and warm. He stopped looking for work. He stopped worrying about the bills. He started focusing on the logistics of the end. The Grim Reaper had arrived at Breeze Knoll, and he was wearing a suit and tie. He didn't snap. That is the most terrifying thing about John List. We like to think of monsters as chaotic, foaming beasts, creatures of sudden, uncontrollable rage. But John was an accountant. He dealt in columns, in balances, in the neat and tidy organization of figures. And so he organized his family's execution with the same dry, bureaucratic efficiency he used to file a tax return. In the days leading up to the end, a strange calm settled over him, a serenity that comes only to those who believe they have solved an impossible puzzle. He walked through the rooms of Breeze Knoll, his footsteps soft on the hardwood, looking at his wife and children not as people with futures, but as liabilities he had to liquidate for their own good. He had convinced himself of a twisted, poisonous truth, that killing them was the ultimate act of fatherly love. In his mind, the world was a sinking ship of sin and poverty. If they lived, they would be poor. If they were poor, they would turn away from the church. They would be corrupted. But if they died now, innocent, or at least still under his roof, they would go straight to heaven. He wasn't a murderer in his own eyes. He was a travel agent booking their one-way tickets to paradise before the prices went up. He sat at his desk, the heavy oak seemingly absorbing the darkness of his thoughts, and began to make lists. He was always making lists. But this wasn't a grocery list. It was a checklist for annihilation. He calculated exactly how much time he would need to escape before anyone noticed the silence in the big house on the hill. He needed a head start, a long one. So, he began to systematically sever the cords that tethered the List family to the outside world, one by one. He called the milkman and suspended delivery, his voice steady and polite, lying that the family would be visiting a sick relative in North Carolina. He stopped the mail. He called the children's schools, weaving intricate lies about an extended family emergency that required immediate travel. He was erasing them from society before he had even pulled the trigger. He moved through these tasks with a terrifying casualness, smiling at neighbors, waving to the postman, all while the clock in his head ticked down to 0. Then came the tools of the trade. He didn't own a weapon suitable for what he had to do. He needed something efficient, something that wouldn't fail him. He drove to a gun shop, a mundane errand in the middle of a mundane Tuesday. He purchased a 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic handgun and a .22 caliber revolver. He didn't hide them in a dark alley. He bought them over the counter, a citizen exercising his rights. He even took the time to go to a shooting range. Picture that, this pious, stiff-backed man in his church clothes, standing in a booth at a gun range, firing round after round at a paper target. Pop, 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 adjusting his glasses, checking his aim. Each hole in the paper wasn't just practice. It was a rehearsal for the back of a head. He was practicing the murder of his own flesh and blood, and his pulse likely never even quickened. He returned home, cleaned the weapons, and hid them away. The nights were the hardest to understand. He would sit at the dinner table with them, breaking bread, passing the salt, listening to his daughter Patricia talk about her drama club, hearing Frederick talk about his day. He looked at their faces, faces he had kissed goodnight for years, and he felt nothing. No sorrow, no hesitation, just a cold, steely resolve. He looked at his wife, Helen, her face lined with the stress of their financial woes and her own hidden struggles, and he thought, soon, you will be at peace. He looked at his mother upstairs, the woman who gave him life, and decided he would take hers too. He spent the final evening, November 8th, in prayer. But he wasn't asking God for forgiveness. He was asking for strength to keep his hand steady. He wrote a letter, not to the police, but to his pastor. A 5-page confession explaining his reasoning, detailing the financial ruin, the fear of the 1970s counterculture, the desperate need to save their souls. He left it on his desk, unsealed. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The lights were about to go out at Breeze Knoll, and the curtain was rising on a tragedy that would haunt the town for half a century. The sun went down on the last normal day the List family would ever see. John went to bed, closed his eyes, and slept the sleep of the righteous, knowing that when he woke up, he would become the angel of death. November 9th, 1971. It was a Tuesday, typically the most forgettable day of the week. The sun rose pale and cold over Westfield, casting long, stretching shadows across the frosty lawn of Breeze Knoll. Inside, the house stirred with the chaotic, rhythmic noises of a family waking up. To anyone watching from the outside, perhaps a neighbor grabbing the paper or a milkman driving by, it looked like the start of another ordinary day in suburbia. The lights flickered on in the bedrooms. Water ran in the pipes. The smell of burnt toast and brewing coffee began to drift through the kitchen. Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick stumbled around in the sleepy haze of teenagers, fighting for bathroom time, searching for lost textbooks, complaining about the cold. And in the center of it all stood John List, dressed in his suit and tie, an island of eerie calm in the morning rush. He moved through the kitchen with a ghost-like precision. He poured the juice. He watched them eat. He looked at his watch, not checking to see if they were late, but checking the timeline of his own dark script. He looked at Frederick, the youngest, wiping sleep from his eyes. He looked at Patricia, worrying about her hair. He looked at John Jr., strong and athletic, wolfing down cereal. He didn't feel a pang of regret. He didn't feel the urge to grab them and scream, to run out the door and never look back. Instead, he felt a strange, detached pity. Poor things, he thought. They don't know the mercy I have planned for them. One by one, they grabbed their bags and headed for the door. Goodbye, Dad. They mumbled, their minds already on school, on friends, on the future. John nodded, a tight, thin smile on his lips. Goodbye, he said softly. As the heavy front door clicked shut behind the last child, the sound echoed through the hallway like a gavel striking a judge's bench. The house fell instantly, terribly silent. The air pressure seemed to drop. The masquerade of the father was over. The executioner had clocked in. He turned slowly back toward the kitchen. His wife, Helen, was sitting at the table. She was still in her nightgown, nursing a cup of black coffee, the steam rising and curling around her face. She looked tired, the weight of her own untreated illness and their crumbling marriage etched into the lines around her eyes. She didn't look up as he entered. She was used to his silence. She took a sip, the porcelain cup clicking softly against the saucer. That small, domestic sound would be the last thing she ever heard. John reached into his pocket, his hand wrapped around the cold steel of the Steyr 9mm automatic. It felt heavy, substantial, real. He didn't hesitate. He didn't say a prayer. He didn't ask for a final word. He simply raised the gun, aiming it at the side of her head, and pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot was deafening in the small kitchen, shattering the morning peace. Helen didn't scream. She didn't bargain. She simply slumped forward, her head hitting the table, the coffee cup tipping over and spilling a dark, spreading stain across the tablecloth that began to mix with the brighter, redder fluid now pooling around her. He stood there for a moment, the gun smoking slightly in the cool air, watching the life drain from the woman he had promised to cherish until death did them part. Death had arrived early, but his work wasn't done. He stepped over the spreading puddle, his shoes making no sound, and walked out of the kitchen. He climbed the stairs. 1 flight, 2 flights, up to the 3rd floor, to the attic apartment where his mother, Alma, lived. The stairs creaked under his weight, a wooden groan that seemed to protest his ascent. Alma was 84 years old. She was frail, small, and completely dependent on her son. She had likely heard the bang from downstairs, a confusing thud in the floorboards. As John opened the door to her apartment, she looked up, her face a mask of confusion. "John?" she might have said. "What was that noise?" He didn't answer. He couldn't risk the conversation. He couldn't risk the humanity returning. He walked up to her, the loving son coming to visit, and before she could process the gun in his hand, before she could feel the betrayal, he fired. The bullet struck her above the left eye. She collapsed instantly, her small body looking like a pile of discarded clothes on the floor. 2 down. The silence in the house was now absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a loaded silence, pregnant with the violence that had just occurred and the violence that was yet to come. It was barely 9 a.m. The sun was still climbing. The birds were still singing outside. But inside Breeze Knoll, the air smelled of gunpowder and copper. John List holstered his weapon, adjusted his glasses, and walked back downstairs. He had hours to wait before the children came home, hours to sit with the bodies, hours to prepare for the second act of his nightmare. The silence that followed the morning's violence was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against the eardrums like the pressure at the bottom of the ocean. John List stood in the kitchen, the gun now resting on the counter next to the sugar bowl, and looked at the ruin of his life. Or rather, the beginning of his salvation. But there was a problem. The kitchen was a mess. The floor was slick with the red evidence of his mercy, and the children would be home in a few hours. He couldn't let them walk into a slaughterhouse. That wasn't part of the plan. It had to be orderly. It had to be clean. So, the bank vice president, the Sunday school teacher, rolled up his sleeves and began the grim, physical labor of hiding his sins. He grabbed his wife's body under the arms, her heels dragging with a sickening scrape across the linoleum, and hauled her out of the kitchen. He pulled her through the hallway, her head lolling side to side, past the family portraits that seemed to watch in horror, and into the great ballroom. This cavernous room, once the site of grand parties in a bygone era, was now cold and empty, a perfect tomb. He laid her down gently on a sleeping bag he had prepared, arranging her limbs with a disturbing tenderness. She was the first guest at his macabre party. He returned to the kitchen and got to work. He filled a bucket with hot water and bleach, the chemical smell cutting through the metallic tang of blood. He got down on his hands and knees, scrubbing the floor where his wife had died. Scrub, rinse, repeat. He wiped down the table. He washed the coffee cup she had been drinking from and placed it in the drying rack. It was a surreal, nightmarish scene of domesticity. A man cleaning up a murder scene with the same dutiful attention he would give to spilled milk. When the kitchen was spotless, when the physical traces of Helen were erased, he did something that truly defies comprehension. He made himself lunch. He stood at the same counter, perhaps using the same knife, and prepared a sandwich. He sat at the table, surrounded by the invisible echoes of the gunshot, and ate. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't vomiting. He was refueling. He checked his watch. 1:30 p.m. The wait began. For the next few hours, Breeze Knoll became a stage waiting for its actors. John wandered the house, a ghost haunting his own life. He went upstairs to check on his mother, stepping over her body to check the windows, ensuring the curtains were drawn tight. He came back down and sat in the study, perhaps reading his Bible, seeking confirmation in the verses for the path he had chosen. For the wages of sin is death, he might have whispered to the empty room. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall grew louder, measuring the remaining minutes of his children's lives. He knew their schedules by heart. He knew exactly when the school bus would screech to a halt at the bottom of the hill. He knew how long it took them to walk up the driveway. He positioned himself, not hiding in the shadows, but waiting in the open, the patriarch ready to greet his brood. The first to arrive was his daughter, Patricia, 16 years old, full of teenage dreams, drama club scripts, and the innocent self-absorption of youth. The front door opened, letting in a gust of cold November air. "I'm home," she called out, dropping her bag on the floor. The sound was so normal, so full of life, it should have shattered John's resolve. But he was past the point of return. He walked out to meet her. She likely looked up, surprised to see her father home early from work. Maybe she started to ask, "Dad, why are you?" But the question died in her throat. John raised the .22 caliber revolver this time. Smaller, quieter, but just as deadly. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't say he loved her. He simply fired. The bullet struck her near the jaw, exiting the back of her head. She collapsed instantly, her school books sliding across the floor, her life extinguished before she even understood she was in danger. He didn't mourn. He didn't pause. He dragged her body, lighter than her mother's, but heavier with the weight of lost potential, into the ballroom. He laid her next to Helen. 2 sleeping bags. 2 bodies. He went back to the front hall. He wiped up the blood. He waited again. Next came Frederick, 13 years old, the baby of the family, a boy who loved sports and looked up to his big brother. He came in through the back door this time, bursting with the energy of a boy just released from the confinement of a classroom. He might have been humming a tune or looking for a snack. He walked into the kitchen, the very room where his mother had died hours earlier. John was waiting. The boy saw his father, and for a split second, there was recognition, trust. Then, the gun raised. The crack of the .22. Frederick fell. John looked down at his youngest son, a boy he had taught to catch a ball, a boy he had read bedtime stories to. He felt that same cold, jagged logic. He is safe now. The world can't hurt him. He dragged Frederick's small body across the polished floors, the long journey to the ballroom. He laid him next to his sister and mother. 3 sleeping bags. 3 bodies. The house was filling up with the dead, but the list wasn't checked off yet. There was one name left. The favorite. The athlete. The one who would be the hardest to kill. John Jr. was at a soccer game. He would be home late. So John List sat back down in the silence, surrounded by the smell of bleach and death, and waited for the sun to go down. He had killed the weak. Now he had to kill the strong. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the interior of Breeze Knoll into a gloom that felt appropriate for a mausoleum. The house was now a tomb, holding 4 bodies in its cold embrace. But for John List, the work was not finished. He sat in the darkening kitchen, the silence ringing in his ears, waiting for the final piece of his tragic puzzle. John Jr. was 15 years old, the eldest son, the golden boy. He played soccer. He was popular. He had a future that shone brighter than the others. In many ways, he was the son John List wished he had been: strong, athletic, unburdened by the awkward stiffness that plagued his father. But in John's twisted theology, this potential was a danger. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow it casts. If John Jr. lived, he would be the one to bear the brunt of the family's shame. He would be the one to see his father in handcuffs or the poorhouse. John List convinced himself that he couldn't leave his favorite son behind to suffer the wreckage of their lives. He had to be saved most of all. The headlights of the car swept across the front windows, announcing the boy's arrival. John Jr. had been dropped off after his soccer game, likely tired, his muscles aching, his mind full of the replay of the match. He walked up the driveway, his cleats perhaps clicking on the pavement, completely unaware that he was walking toward his own execution. He opened the back door, entering the kitchen where the smell of bleach and the faint, metallic scent of blood hung in the air like a poisonous fog. "Dad?" he might have called out, noticing the strange stillness of the house. The other children should have been loud. The TV should have been blaring. His mother should have been cooking. Instead, there was only the shadow of his father, standing by the counter, a silhouette of doom. This time, it didn't go according to the script. With the others, it had been a surprise attack, a sudden darkness. But John Jr. was sharp. He was an athlete with reflexes honed on the field. As he stepped further into the room, he saw the gun. He saw the look in his father's eyes, not the look of the mild-mannered accountant, but the blank, shark-like stare of a killer. John List raised the stare 9 millimeters. He fired. But John Jr. didn't just crumple. He moved. The bullet hit him, searing through his chest, but the boy's adrenaline surged. He didn't accept death. He fought it. Chaos erupted in the kitchen. For the first time that day, the silence was shattered not just by gunfire, but by the sounds of a desperate struggle. A chair was knocked over, skittering across the floor. There were grunts of exertion, the scuffle of shoes on linoleum. John Jr., bleeding and shocked, tried to defend himself against the man who had given him life. He may have tried to run, or perhaps he lunged at his father, a final, desperate attempt to disarm the monster. It was a primal scene, the son fighting the father, the future fighting the past. But John List was methodical, and he was armed. He fired again, and again. He pumped multiple bullets into his son's body, effectively emptying the magazine until the boy finally stopped moving. John Jr. collapsed on the floor, his soccer gear stained with his own blood, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps until it stopped altogether. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was heavier. John List stood over his son, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. This kill had been messy. It had been violent in a way the others hadn't. It required him to look his son in the eye while the life faded from them. But he didn't weep. He didn't drop to his knees and scream, "What have I done?" He simply reloaded. He checked the pulse to ensure the job was done. Then, the physical labor began again. John Jr. was heavy, dead weight in the truest sense. John grabbed his son by the arms and began the long, grueling drag to the ballroom. He pulled him past the kitchen island, through the hallway, the heels of his son's sneakers squeaking against the floor. He brought him into the ballroom, the grand chamber of death, and laid him down next to Frederick. The family reunion was complete. Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and now John Jr. They were all there, arranged in a grotesque row on their sleeping bags. John List stood in the doorway of the ballroom, looking at his handiwork. In his mind, he saw them not as corpses, but as angels, freed from the burden of his failures. He had saved them. The hardest part was over. Now he was alone in the big house with 5 bodies and a lifetime of silence ahead of him. But he didn't flee into the night just yet. No, John List was a creature of order. The chaos of the murder was over. The ritual of the aftermath was just beginning. The ballroom was freezing. That was by design. John List walked over to the thermostat, his fingers adjusting the dial with a delicate touch, turning the temperature down until the heating system groaned and died. He needed the house to be cold. He needed to preserve his work. The bodies of his wife and 3 children lay on the floor, resting on sleeping bags like campers at the world's most macabre slumber party. He had arranged them with a terrifying symmetry, their hands folded, their faces peaceful in the repose of death. He had even taken the time to place a cloth over their faces, a final act of twisted modesty, shielding them from the judgment of the room. His mother, Alma, remained upstairs in her attic apartment. She was too heavy for him to carry down the narrow stairs, so he left her there, a lone sentinel in the rafters, while the rest of the family lay in state in the grand hall below. With the physical labor complete, John moved into the psychological phase of his ritual. He didn't pack his bags and run. He didn't panic. He sat down at the heavy mahogany desk in his study, the same desk where he had calculated the mortgage payments that he couldn't afford, and pulled out a fresh sheaf of paper. He uncapped his pen. The house was silent, save for the scratching of the nib against the page. He began to write a letter. It wasn't a suicide note. He had no intention of joining them yet. It was a confession, but not to the police. He addressed it to his pastor. Over the course of 5 dense, meticulously written pages, he laid out his case. He didn't write like a madman scrawling in blood. He wrote like an accountant filing a report. He explained the financial insolvency, the stealing, the loss of his job. But then the logic twisted into the spiritual. He explained that the world was becoming too evil, that the 1970s were a cesspool of sin that would surely drag his family to hell. He wrote that he had killed them to save their souls, to ensure they would wake up in the arms of God rather than face the poverty and shame of reality. He signed it, folded it, and left it prominently on the desk, a manifesto of his madness waiting to be read. Then came the most chilling act of the entire night. John stood up and began to wander through the house, a pair of scissors in his hand. He went to every wall, every mantelpiece, every bedside table where a family photograph stood. He looked at the images of happier times, vacations, birthdays, graduations. He saw his wife smiling, his children growing up, and he saw himself, the stiff, bespectacled man in the background. With a surgical precision, he took the scissors and cut his own face out of every single picture. Snip, a headless father standing next to a smiling daughter. Snip, an empty void where the husband should be. He wasn't just killing his family. He was erasing himself from history. He wanted to be a ghost. He left the photos in their frames, mutilated and haunting, so that whoever found them would see a family destroyed by a man who had ceased to exist. The final touches of the stage were set. He didn't want the house to look dark and abandoned. That would attract attention too soon. He walked from room to room, turning on the lights. The kitchen, the hallway, the study. He illuminated them all, creating the illusion of a bustling, happy home. For anyone driving by on Hillside Avenue, he found a radio and tuned it to a station playing classical religious music, turning the volume up just enough so that the solemn hymns would drift through the empty halls, a funeral dirge that would play on a loop for the dead. And then, in a display of compartmentalization that is almost impossible to fathom, John List made himself dinner. He sat in the kitchen, just feet away from the bloodstains he had scrubbed, and ate. He washed the dishes. He dried them. And then he went to sleep. He didn't flee into the night immediately. He slept in the house of the dead. He laid his head down on a pillow, perhaps in a guest room or a couch, surrounded by the corpses of the people he had murdered, and closed his eyes. He slept the sleep of a man who believes he has finished a hard day's work. The house hummed with the sound of the radio, the lights blazed into the darkness, and the temperature slowly dropped, turning Breeze Knoll into a refrigerated tomb. The curtain had fallen on the List family, but John was already preparing for his encore as a new man. The morning of November 10th broke with a deceptive normalcy. John List rose before the sun, dressed in his suit and tie for the final time in that house, and walked out the door. He didn't look back at the 19-room tomb he had created. He got into his car and drove away, leaving behind a silence that would stretch on for weeks. Breeze Knoll was now alone. It stood on the hill, fully illuminated, blazing with light in the middle of the day, a lighthouse of madness warning ships away from the rocks. Inside, the temperature plummeted. The furnace was dead. The air grew frigid, preserving the secrets hidden in the ballroom. And through the empty halls, the radio played on, a solemn, unending loop of organ music and hymns, a requiem for an audience of 5 corpses. Days turned into weeks. The world outside moved on. Thanksgiving arrived, families gathered, turkeys were carved, and gratitude was spoken. But at 431 Hillside Avenue, the only guests were ghosts. The neighbors began to notice something strange. The lights, which John had left on to simulate life, began to burn out one by one. It was a slow, creeping darkness. First a light in the upstairs bedroom flickered and died. Then the porch light. The house, once bright and defiant, began to look like a skull with missing teeth, staring blankly out at the street. The mail piled up, despite the stop order John had tried to place. The milk deliveries had ceased, but the absence of movement around the property became heavy, oppressive. People walked their dogs past the mansion and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. They saw the drapes drawn tight. They saw the unnatural stillness. The house seemed to be holding its breath. It was Patricia's drama teacher, a man named Ed Iliano, who refused to let the silence lie. He knew Patricia. He knew she wouldn't just vanish to North Carolina without a word, without saying goodbye to her friends or her castmates. The excuse John had planted, the sick grandmother, didn't sit right with him. It felt too neat, too rehearsed. He drove by the house repeatedly, watching the lights die, watching the shadows lengthen. He saw the car was gone, but the feeling of dread remained. He pestered the police, urging them to check, to just knock on the door, to make sure. But this was 1971. People respected privacy. and the police were hesitant to break into the home of a respected Sunday school teacher just because the lights were burning out. But the unease grew. It spread through the neighborhood like a low-frequency hum. Finally, on the evening of December 7th, nearly a full month after the shots were fired, the spell broke. Patrolman George Nakos and his partner pulled up to the mansion. The house was mostly dark now, a looming shadow against the night sky. They walked up the porch steps, their boots crunching on dead leaves. They knocked. Silence. They knocked again. Only the wind answered. They found an unlocked window, perhaps the only oversight John had made, or perhaps a subconscious invitation. As they climbed inside, the first thing that hit them wasn't the smell. The cold had mercifully delayed that, but the sound. The music. It was faint, ghostly, drifting from the kitchen. A choir singing praises to God in a house where God seemed to have left a long time ago. The officers moved through the freezing rooms, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The air was colder inside than it was outside. They saw the neatness, the order, the eerie perfection of a house frozen in time. They moved toward the ballroom, the grandest room in the house. The doors were closed. They pushed them open, and their beams of light swept across the floor. There, in the center of the vast, empty space, lay the sleeping bags. 1, 2, 3, 4. The officers froze. The horror wasn't just in the presence of the bodies. It was in the staging. They were lined up perfectly. A cloth covered each face, a shroud of decency over an act of supreme indecency. They lifted a corner of a cloth and saw the face of Emil List. They saw the children. The shock was physical, a punch to the gut. They looked around for the father, the man of the house. But he wasn't on the floor. He wasn't in the corner. They went upstairs and found Alma, the grandmother, still lying in her attic apartment, the 5th victim of the massacre. But the 6th member of the family was nowhere to be found. They found the letter on the desk, the confession laid out like a business proposal. They found the family photos, the faces smiling, except for one. In every frame, a jagged hole where the father's face should have been. The officers realized with a dawning horror that they weren't just standing in a crime scene. They were standing in a month-old crime scene. The blood was dry. The killer had a 4-week head start. The trail wasn't just cold, it was frozen solid. While the police were staring at the carnage in Westfield, John List was already a ghost, dissolved into the ether of America, a man without a face and without a name. The manhunt began with a scream of sirens that shattered the peace of Westfield, but it was a scream into the void. The police were chasing a phantom. As the coroner's wagons rolled away from Breeze Knoll, carrying the 5 victims to the morgue, detectives were frantically trying to piece together the movements of a man who had been gone for nearly 30 days. Every hour that had ticked by in that silent, freezing house was an hour John List had used to put distance between himself and his sins. An all-points bulletin went out across the nation. Wanted for murder, John Emil List. His face, the face he had meticulously cut out of the family photos, was plastered on wanted posters. But the police were looking for a ghost, and ghosts are notoriously hard to catch. They found his car first, and it felt like a breakthrough. The 1961 Chevrolet Impala was parked at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. It was sitting there, collecting dust, a metal breadcrumb left specifically for them to find. The detectives swarmed the airport. They were convinced he had fled the country. It made perfect sense. A man with his meticulous nature, a man who had liquidated his mother's savings, would surely take a flight to somewhere without an extradition treaty. They checked flight manifests for Brazil, for Europe, for anywhere a man could disappear. They interviewed ticket agents, showed the photo of the stiff, bespectacled accountant. But it was all smoke and mirrors. The car was a decoy, a brilliant, calculated misdirection designed to make the police look up at the sky while he was slipping away on the ground. John List hadn't flown anywhere. While the police were scouring international flight logs, John had simply walked away from the car, bought a bus ticket, and dissolved into the gray, anonymous stream of American travelers. He became a face in the crowd, a man reading a newspaper on a Greyhound bus, watching the landscape shift from the industrial gray of the East Coast to the rolling plains of the Midwest. He didn't run like a criminal. He relocated like a retiree. He headed west, eventually landing in Denver, Colorado. It was 1972, a time before digital footprints, before facial recognition, before the internet connected every police station in the world. It was a time when a man could walk into a town, invent a name, and simply start over. And that is exactly what the mass murderer did. He didn't hide in a basement. He didn't grow a beard or undergo plastic surgery. He did something far more chilling. He became boring. He shed the skin of John Emil List, the failed bank vice president, and stepped into the shoes of Robert Peter Clark, or simply Bob. Bob Clark was a quiet man, a soft-spoken man. He got a Social Security card under his new name, a task that was laughably easy in those days. He needed work, but he knew he couldn't return to high-level finance. The background checks would be too risky. So, the man who had killed his family rather than suffer the indignity of poverty put on an apron. He took a job as a short-order fry cook at a diner. Picture it. The man who believed he was an aristocrat of the soul, flipping burgers and frying eggs for truckers, smiling politely, wiping down counters. It was the ultimate act of camouflage. Who looks at a fry cook and sees a monster? Who suspects the quiet guy in the corner of executing his wife and children? He blended in perfectly. He was the beige wallpaper of society. As the years rolled by, the heat died down. The trail in New Jersey went from cold to frozen. The police had nothing. No sightings. No fingerprints. No leads. The Breeze Knoll mansion burned down in a mysterious fire months after the murders. Some say it was arson, a final cleansing of the evil that lived there, destroying the last physical anchor to the crime. John List was effectively dead to the world. But Bob Clark was very much alive. He eventually moved back into accounting, confident that his cover was impenetrable. He moved to Virginia. He joined a Lutheran church, singing the same hymns he had played on the radio for his dead family. He was a devout member of the congregation, always helpful, always pious. He even found love again. Or perhaps another prop for his performance. He met a woman named Dolores Miller at a church social. She was an Army PX clerk, a kind, unsuspecting woman who saw in Bob a gentle, lonely soul. They dated. They fell in love. And in a twist that would make the devil himself pause, John List got married again. He stood at the altar, promised to love and cherish this woman, all while the bodies of his first wife and 3 children lay in unmarked graves in New Jersey. He hosted dinner parties. He went to potlucks. He lived a completely normal, suburban life for nearly 18 years. He was the perfect neighbor. The guy who mowed his lawn on Saturdays. The guy who waved hello. He had successfully erased the massacre from his existence, burying it under layers of mundane routine. He proved that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looks like a mild-mannered accountant named Bob who brings a casserole to the church picnic. He had gotten away with it. Or so he thought. It was 1989. The world had spun on its axis for nearly 18 years since the guns fell silent in Westfield. The Vietnam War was long over, the Berlin Wall was teetering, and disco had died a slow death. But in the Union County Prosecutor's Office in New Jersey, time had stopped in 1971. For a small group of investigators, the John List file was a wound that refused to close. It was a thick, dusty accordion folder filled with crime scene photos of the ballroom, the letter to the pastor, and the endless, fruitless leads that had gone nowhere. John List was the boogeyman of New Jersey, the ghost who walked through walls. Most had given up hope of ever finding him. They assumed he was dead, perhaps lying in a ditch somewhere, or sipping piña coladas in South America under a new name. But Captain Frank Marrero and his team had one last card to play. It was a Hail Mary pass thrown into the electronic ether. A new television show had just launched, a program that turned armchair detectives into deputies. It was called America's Most Wanted. The show agreed to feature the case, but they had a massive problem. They didn't know what John List looked like. Not really. The only photos they had were nearly 2 decades old, black and white relics of a man in his 40s. A man changes in 18 years. He grays, he sags, he shrinks. Showing the old photo on TV would be useless. John List could walk right past a viewer, and they wouldn't recognize him. They needed a time machine. Enter Frank Bender. Bender wasn't a cop. He wasn't a computer algorithm. He was an artist, a forensic sculptor with a mystic's intuition. He didn't just mold clay. He claimed to mold the soul. The police gave him the old, grainy photos of List, the ones obtained from records, since List had so carefully decapitated the family portraits. Bender sat in his studio in Philadelphia, surrounded by busts of the dead and the missing, and stared into the eyes of the mass murderer. He didn't just think about biology. He thought about psychology. He profiled the man through the clay. He knew List was rigid, pious, repressed, and joyless. He imagined how 18 years of guilt, fear, and hiding would etch themselves onto a human face. He pictured gravity pulling down the cheeks of a man who never smiled. He thickened the neck. He receded the hairline. But the genius was in the details. Bender went to a thrift store and found a pair of thick, dark-rimmed glasses, the kind a conservative, pompous accountant would wear to feel important. He placed them on the clay bust. He tilted the head slightly, giving the face a look of arrogant judgment, a sneer of moral superiority. When he stepped back, the face that stared at him wasn't John List from 1971. It was John List now. It was a creation born of nightmare and intuition, a clay golem designed to hunt its master. The resemblance was so uncanny, so specific, that it sent shivers down the spines of the detectives who saw it. It looked like a real person. It looked like a man you might see in line at the grocery store. On May 21st, 1989, the signal went out. The episode of America's Most Wanted aired to millions of living rooms across the country. The host, John Walsh, narrated the horrific story of the Breeze Knoll massacre. The milk, the music, the sleeping bodies. The tension built with every word. And then, the reveal. The camera zoomed in tight on Frank Bender's clay bust, the face of the monster. "This is what we believe John List looks like today," Walsh said. The image burned into the cathode ray tubes of televisions from coast to coast. It was a digital dragnet, casting a net over the entire population. In a suburb of Richmond, Virginia, a woman was watching. She wasn't looking for a killer. She was just passing time. But when the face of the bust appeared on the screen, Her heart hammered against her ribs. The glasses, the receding hair, the droop of the lip, the arrogance. She knew that face. She didn't know a mass murderer named John List. But she knew her neighbor. She knew the quiet churchgoer down the street. She knew the man who was married to her friend Dolores. She knew Bob Clark. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just similar, it was him. Her hand trembled as she reached for the phone. She dialed the number on the screen. I think. She hesitated, the weight of the accusation pressing down on her. I think my neighbor is the man you're looking for. I think Bob Clark is John List. The tip was logged. The tumblers of fate clicked into place. The clay face had done its job. The ghost was about to be busted. The phone call from the neighbor in Virginia was the ripple that turned into a tidal wave. On June 1st, 1989, 11 days after the broadcast, FBI agents and detectives from New Jersey arrived at the suburban home on Brandermill Parkway in Richmond. It was a nice house, unassuming, with a manicured lawn that echoed the precision of Breeze Knoll nearly 2 decades earlier. They watched the house. They saw a man come out. He was older now, his hair gray and thinning, his shoulders slightly stooped, but the walk was the same. The rigid, mechanical gait of a man who marched to an internal metronome. It was Bob Clark. But to the detectives, the ghost of John List was walking right toward them. They approached him. "Excuse me, sir," one might have said, the air thick with the humidity of the South and the tension of the moment. "Are you John List?" The man looked at them, his eyes behind those thick glasses unblinking, calm, devoid of fear. "No," he said, his voice steady, a flat drone. "I am Robert Clark." He didn't run. He didn't fight. He stood there with the indignation of a man wrongly accused. Even as they handcuffed him, even as they put him in the back of the car, he maintained the charade. He was Bob. He had a wife. He had a job. This was all a terrible mistake. For months, he sat in a jail cell, playing the role of the confused victim. He refused to answer to the name John. He stared at the walls, perhaps calculating the odds of his deception holding up. But science does not care about acting. The authorities pulled his fingerprints, prints that had been on file from his military service in World War II and his time as a squeaky clean accountant. They ran the comparison. It wasn't a close match. It was a perfect overlay. The loops and whirls of Bob Clark's fingers were the exact same loops and whirls that had loaded the Steyr 9mm in 1971. Confronted with the undeniable biological truth, the mask finally cracked. But it didn't shatter into remorse. It simply shifted. On February 16, 1990, the man finally admitted, "I am John List." But he didn't weep. He didn't beg for forgiveness. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. The jury looked at this frail, old man and tried to reconcile him with the monster who had slaughtered his entire bloodline. List took the stand, and for the first time, the world heard the voice of the Breeze Knoll butcher. It was dry. It was boring. It was the voice of a man explaining a tax loophole. He told the jury exactly what he had written in the letter to his pastor. He spoke of the financial pressure, the fear of poverty, the danger to his family's souls. He spoke of killing his wife, his mother, his children, as if he were describing a difficult business decision he had been forced to make. "I knew it was wrong to kill," he said, "but I felt that it was the only way to save them." He claimed he was a victim of post-traumatic stress disorder, a victim of the times, a victim of his own love. The jury wasn't buying what the accountant was selling. They didn't see a savior. They saw a narcissist who annihilated his family to save his own ego. It took them only 9 hours to deliberate. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted, but John List stood motionless. When the judge handed down the sentence, 5 consecutive life terms, he added a stinging rebuke. John List is without remorse and without honor. After 18 years, I don't think he has any contrition. The only reason he is not facing the death penalty is that the state did not have it at the time of the crimes. List was led away, destined to die in a cage, just as he had feared his family would live in poverty. John List spent the next 18 years in prison. He was a model prisoner. He filed appeals. He worked in the prison library. He faded into the background, just as he always had. He died on March 21, 2008, at the age of 82, from complications of pneumonia. But the true horror of this story isn't the murder or the flight or the trial. It is the ending John List wrote for himself in his own mind. In an interview before his death, he was asked if he thought he would go to heaven. He looked at the reporter with those dead, shark-like eyes and said, "I hope so." He believed that because he had saved his family, because he had sent them to God before they could be corrupted, they would be there waiting for him. He imagined a reunion in the afterlife where Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. would welcome him with open arms, thanking him for his mercy. He died believing he was the hero of the story. He died believing he had won. And that, perhaps, is the darkest thing of all, that a man can paint the walls with the blood of his children and still look in the mirror and see a saint.